No pictures, no pictures. What did I tell you? I'm gonna break that camera.
I'm just practicing.
Don't practice this way.
Yeah, because Dave's not here.
The group arrived in Cuba on February 17th, 2002. I thought that the airport would be crawling with Cuban revolutionaries in army fatigues carrying Kalashnikov submachine guns. Not so. In fact, I didn't see one gun while I was in Cuba. But I'm getting ahead of myself. After I decided I would go to Cuba, I went online to book a trip. Because of the US embargo against Cuba, or the Bloqueo as it's called by the Cubans, it's almost impossible for US citizens to travel to Cuba legally. There are a lot of different elements to the embargo of Cuba, but here's a quick synopsis. In 1958, while Fulgencio Batista was fighting Castro and the Cuban rebels, an arms embargo was put in place by U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Fidel Castro took power January 1, 1959, and in 1960, Cuba began buying arms from the Soviet Union. So, in retaliation, the Eisenhower administration limited the amount of brown sugar that could be imported from Cuba to the United States. So the Soviet Union said it would buy all of Cuba's sugar. Then, in October 1960, Castro nationalized 3 American-owned oil refineries because they refused to refine crude oil from the Soviet Union. And the Eisenhower administration began the embargo, which prohibited the sale of goods to Cuba except for food and medicine. So in 1961, the assets of all American-owned companies were seized, and these companies nationalized. The U.S. broke diplomatic ties with Cuba in January of 1961. But the real reason I couldn't book a flight to Havana was because of the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, which were put in place by President Kennedy in 1962 after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Many believe that U.S. citizens are forbidden to travel to Cuba. Not so. It's just that you're not allowed to spend any money in Cuba. And of course, you're not allowed to accept any gifts while you are there. But there are exceptions. As I was looking in the local free news weekly in Pittsburgh, I just happened to see a small item mentioning a trip to Cuba being organized by the US Cuba Sister Cities Association. I found out that the US Cuba Sister Cities Association was based in Pittsburgh and that I would need to talk to Lisa Valanti. So I called her. She talked. I listened.
Why do Americans have a penalty of 10 years in prison and $250,000 fine for coming here without U.S. government authorization? When we have everybody from around the world, and you're bumping into tourists from everywhere, and it's an international embarrassment. When I meet people from around the country, around the world, they say to me, "Oh yeah, you're from the land of the free, ha ha ha," because we can't go 90 miles off our own shore without a leash. And yet we have these illusions. We live in this virtual reality.